The sun set crimson over the Pennsylvania fields on July 3, 1863, painting the sky the same color as the blood-soaked ground below. For 3 days, the armies of the Union and Confederacy had torn at each other with unprecedented ferocity, leaving over 50,000 men dead, wounded, or missing. As the guns fell silent and the smoke began to clear, few recognized that this battle would mark not just a turning point in the Civil War, but a transformative moment for African Americans whose stories would be etched into the very soul of Gettysburg's legacy. Among those watching from afar was Abraham Hayes, a free black man who had fled north from Maryland years earlier, now living just 5 miles from the battlefield. Through the distant thunder of cannon fire, he had prayed for a Union victory, knowing what was at stake for his people still in bondage. "I heard the great roar," he would later recall to a Philadelphia Inquirer reporter in 1875, "and knew that each shot might mean one step closer to freedom for all of us, or one step backward into deeper darkness." When Confederate General Robert E. Lee's forces began their retreat southward on July 4th, Hayes was among the first African Americans to venture onto the battlefield. What he found defied description: a landscape transformed by violence, the dead and dying scattered across farms and fields. Yet amid this horror, Hayes and other local black residents did not hesitate. They joined the desperate efforts to aid the wounded, bringing water, bandages, and what comfort they could offer to Union soldiers. "They came without being asked," wrote Lieutenant Thomas Chamberlain of the 150th Pennsylvania Volunteers in his memoirs. "Black men and women moved among the wounded with water and food, asking nothing in return, though they surely knew they risked capture by Confederate stragglers." These first black responders at Gettysburg have been largely overlooked in traditional histories. Records from the United States Sanitary Commission, which coordinated much of the medical relief effort, make only passing mention of colored helpers, without recording their names or specific contributions. Yet their presence was noted by many soldiers who owed their lives to these acts of mercy. One such soldier was Corporal James Wilkinson of the 20th Maine, who wrote in his journal, "A Negro man whose name I never learned held my hand through the night as I burned with fever. He bathed my brow and prayed over me until dawn. I do not think I would have seen morning without him." What made these acts of compassion all the more remarkable was their context. Just days before the battle, Confederate forces had kidnapped dozens of free black Pennsylvanians during their march northward, sending them south into slavery. According to research published in the Journal of African American History, at least 50 black residents of Gettysburg and surrounding Adams County were captured by Lee's army and transported south, never to return to their homes and families. For the African Americans who remained helping the Union wounded was not merely humanitarian work, but an act of resistance and survival. They understood viscerally what many white Northerners still did not fully grasp: that this war had become, inevitably, a war over slavery itself. Elizabeth Butler, a washerwoman in Gettysburg whose husband had joined the United States Colored Troops earlier that year, opened her small home to 3 wounded Union soldiers. "They fighting for us now," she reportedly told a neighbor, "so we fight for them how we can." As the initial shock of battle gave way to the grim realities of its aftermath, African Americans would play crucial roles in the recovery efforts that would stretch on for months. Their contributions during these first critical days saved countless lives and forged connections that would shape the post-war era in ways none could yet imagine. For Hayes, Butler, and many others, Gettysburg was not just a distant headline, but the beginning of a new chapter in their own fight for freedom. By mid-July 1863, the immediate medical emergency at Gettysburg had given way to an equally daunting task: burying the dead. With over 7,000 soldiers killed outright during the fighting, and many more dying daily from their wounds, the work of interment became urgent as summer heat accelerated decomposition. It was in this grim necessity that African Americans found themselves playing a crucial but historically overlooked role. David Harris, a former slave who had escaped to Pennsylvania in 1858, led a burial detail composed entirely of black laborers. The white men couldn't stomach it after a while, Harris later recounted to a reporter from Harper's Weekly in 1870. "We did what had to be done. Each man we put in the ground, I said to myself, that's one who died so others might be free." even if some of them never thought of it that way. The burial crews worked methodically across the battlefield, identifying bodies when possible, recording details of uniforms and personal effects, and marking graves with crude wooden headboards. According to records from the Pennsylvania College, hospital African American burial details handled nearly 2,000 interments, mostly of Confederate dead that white burial crews often refused to touch. The colored burial team showed remarkable dignity in their work, wrote Dr. Henry Janes, a Union medical director, in his official report. They treated enemy dead with the same care as our own, despite knowing these men had fought to keep them enslaved. This aspect of post-battle recovery remained largely uncommented upon by Northern newspapers, which preferred to focus on the heroism of white soldiers and medical personnel. Yet contemporary diaries and letters reveal that the presence of black burial workers made a profound impression on many observers. Lieutenant Marcus Woodcock of the 9th Kentucky Infantry wrote to his wife, "I witnessed a scene today that would pierce the hardest heart. A group of Negro men carefully wrapping the body of a Confederate captain in a blanket before lowering him into the ground. One whispered a prayer over him, though the dead man would likely have considered them less than human in life." The irony was not lost on the black workers themselves. Samuel Delaney, who participated in burial details for 3 weeks after the battle, recalled in an interview with the American Freedmen's Inquiry Commission in 1864. "Some boys found letters in Confederate pockets talking about how they'd catch runaway Nadaks when they won the war. We buried those men anyway, with as much respect as anyone else. That's the difference between them and us." Beyond the immediate task of burial lay the challenge of identification. Here, too, local African Americans played vital roles. Women like Harriet Casey and Julia Leister, both laundresses in Gettysburg before the battle, volunteered to wash and catalog bloodied uniforms and personal effects, creating records that would later help families locate their loved ones' remains. "Miss Casey has an extraordinary memory for details," wrote Andrew Curtin, governor of Pennsylvania, after visiting the identification efforts. "She has helped identify over 100 soldiers through items as small as initials scratched inside, a belt buckle or peculiar stitching on a shirt collar." The work was spiritually taxing as well as physically demanding. Many black workers participated in improvised funeral services for the dead, particularly for unidentified soldiers who might otherwise have been buried without ceremony. Reverend Chauncey Schaffer, a white chaplain with the Christian Commission, recorded witnessing a colored man named Washington, who offered the most moving prayer over a row of 20 graves that I have ever heard, asking God to receive these souls even as they had helped break the chains of his people. As summer turned to autumn, and the initial burial work gave way to more systematic reinterment projects, African American workers remained integral to the process. When the plan for a national cemetery at Gettysburg began taking shape, Blackie laborers helped exhume and relocate Union bodies to their final resting places. By November 18th, when President Lincoln arrived to dedicate the cemetery with his immortal address, the landscape had been transformed not just by the battle, but by the combined efforts of thousands of workers, many of them black Americans, whose own citizenship and humanity remained contested. Though they stood at the margins during Lincoln's speech, their labor had made possible his consecration of ground already hallowed by their work and care. The departure of armies did not signal a return to normalcy for Gettysburg's African American community. Instead, the battle's aftermath catalyzed profound transformations that would reshape their lives and community for generations to come. By autumn 1863, the black population of Adams County had begun to increase notably as refugees, freedom seekers, and those seeking to contribute to Union efforts made their way to this now symbolic ground. "The colored population of our town has nearly doubled since July," reported the Gettysburg compiler in November 1863, with unmistakable concern. Many come seeking word of relatives taken by the rebels during their occupation, while others arrive daily from the South, drawn by rumors of opportunities and protection. For established black residents like Catherine Kitty Payne, a former slave who had won her freedom through Pennsylvania courts a decade earlier, this influx presented both challenges and opportunities. Payne converted part of her small home into a boarding house for newcomers, charging minimal rent while helping them find employment among the massive recovery efforts still underway. Mrs. Payne's house became something of a beacon, wrote Rebecca Smith, a Quaker relief worker, in her diary from December 1863. She maintains lists of which farmers need harvest help, which burial details require more hands, and which hospitals still seek laundresses and cooks. Through her efforts alone, I believe at least 40 souls have found sustenance and purpose. This informal network of mutual aid among African Americans expanded rapidly throughout late 1863 and early 1864. Historian Leon Litwack of the University of California documented how black churches in and around Gettysburg became centers not just of worship, but of community organization, employment referrals, and education initiatives. The AME Zion congregation, which had existed in Gettysburg since the 1840s, now expanded its mission to include relief work and advocacy. A key figure in this community mobilization was Basil Biggs, a free black farmer who had fled Gettysburg with his family before the battle to avoid potential capture by Confederate forces. Upon returning, he found his farm damaged, but not destroyed. Rather than focus solely on his personal recovery, Biggs leveraged his relative prosperity to employ newly arrived African Americans in rebuilding efforts. By 1864, Biggs had secured contracts to exhume and rebury Union soldiers in the National Cemetery, work that provided employment for dozens of black laborers. Mr. Biggs has demonstrated remarkable business acumen, noted Congressman Thaddeus Stevens after a visit to Gettysburg in early 1864. He has turned the solemn necessity of proper burial into an opportunity for his people to earn wages and dignity simultaneously. Education emerged as another critical frontier in post-battle Gettysburg, with Union victory at Gettysburg reinforcing Northern resolve to see the war through to abolition. Northern relief societies began establishing schools for black children and adults in the area. By February 1864, the Pennsylvania Freedmen's Relief Association had established a school in a rented room near the town square, employing Elizabeth Thorne, whose husband was still serving in the Union Army, as its first teacher. The colored school numbers 47 pupils, ranging in age from 6 to 60, reported the Adams Sentinel in April 1864. Their eagerness for learning matches their understanding that education, long denied them by law and custom, represents their surest path to genuine freedom. Not all changes were positive, however. The influx of African Americans into Gettysburg triggered backlash from some white residents who feared economic competition and social change. Court records from 1864 show an increase in prosecutions for vagrancy and petty theft, targeting black newcomers, often resulting in punitive workforce arrangements that resembled the very bondage they had escaped. The freedom promised by Gettysburg's Union victory remains theoretical for many, wrote Frederick Douglass after visiting the town in 1865. I found colored men working for former Confederate sympathizers under conditions barely distinguishable from slavery, compelled by necessity and prejudice to accept whatever terms are offered. Despite these challenges, by the war's end in 1865, Gettysburg's African American community had established itself as a vital, resilient presence in the town's recovery and reimagining. Their labor had buried the dead, rebuilt the infrastructure, and begun the long process of constructing new lives amid the physical and psychological ruins of battle. Through churches, mutual aid societies, and informal networks, they created institutions that would sustain them through the difficult years of Reconstruction and beyond, transforming a site of unprecedented bloodshed into hallowed ground for freedom's promise. While no United States colored troops fought at the Battle of Gettysburg, the aftermath of this pivotal engagement profoundly shaped African American military service and how that service would be remembered or forgotten in American memory. By late 1863, as the significance of the Union victory in Pennsylvania became clear, black enlistment surged across the North, inspired in part by the battle's promise of turning the war decisively toward emancipation. James Henry Gooding, a sailor-turned-soldier with the Massachusetts 54th Infantry, wrote to his former newspaper, the New Bedford Mercury, in August 1863, "Gettysburg has shown us what is possible. If white men can die by the thousands for this Union, how can we colored men do any less when our freedom hangs in the balance? The road from Gettysburg leads straight to Richmond, and we mean to walk it alongside our white comrades." For many black soldiers, Gettysburg took on symbolic significance that transcended the actual battle. William Tillman, who enlisted in the 26th U.S. Colored Infantry in December 1863, carried soil from the battlefield in a small pouch around his neck throughout his service. "This ground drank the blood of men who opened the door for us to wear the uniform," he explained in a letter to his sister. "I carry it to remember what I'm fighting for." As the war progressed, several black veterans of later campaigns made pilgrimages to Gettysburg, seeking to connect their own service with the battle now widely recognized as the war's turning point. The most well-documented of these visits occurred in October 1864, when Sergeant Major Christian Fleetwood, who had recently been awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions at the Battle of New Market Heights, traveled to Gettysburg with 4 other decorated black soldiers. "We stood upon Cemetery Ridge today," Fleetwood wrote in his diary, "where the rebellion reached its high water mark. I felt a shiver knowing that had the tide not turned here, our chance to prove ourselves as soldiers might never have come. Every black man who now wears blue owes something to those who held this ground." The relationship between black veterans and Gettysburg grew more complex after the war's end. During early commemoration ceremonies, African American veterans were often excluded or marginalized. When the Grand Army of the Republic held its first major reunion at Gettysburg in 1869, black veterans were relegated to separate accommodations and largely excluded from formal proceedings. "We who bled for the same flag found ourselves unwelcome at the tables where victory was celebrated," wrote Joseph Wilson of the 5th Massachusetts Cavalry in the Christian Recorder, the national newspaper of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. "At Gettysburg, of all places, where the nation claims to have found new birth, we remain stepchildren at the family gathering." Despite these exclusions, black veterans created their own commemorative traditions at Gettysburg. Records from the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association show that the Jenkins Guards, a black militia company from Harrisburg, made annual excursions to the battlefield beginning in 1872. They would march in formation to Cemetery Ridge, hold memorial services for the fallen, and camp overnight, creating a parallel tradition of remembrance outside the officially sanctioned events. Sergeant George Washington Williams, who served in the U.S. Colored Troops and later became a prominent historian, visited Gettysburg in 1881 while researching his groundbreaking work, History of the Negro Troops in the War of the Rebellion. Walking the battlefield, Williams reflected on the paradox of black military service. Here, where not a single Negro soldier fought, may be found the justification for every colored regiment that later faced Confederate guns. Gettysburg made our service possible, and our service made the fulfillment of Gettysburg's promise possible. By the late 19th century, as veterans North and South began collaborating on battlefield preservation and commemoration projects, the question of how to represent black military contributions remained contentious. When plans for monuments and tablets accelerated in the 1880s, African American veterans organizations submitted multiple proposals for markers honoring black military service in the war that Gettysburg had helped define. One proposal, submitted by the Colored Soldiers and Sailors League in 1888, requested permission to erect a monument not to black participants in the battle itself, there having been none in combat roles, but to the black soldiers whose service became possible through the victory achieved here. The proposal was rejected by the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association, which maintained that only units present during the battle could be commemorated on the field. This decision established a commemorative framework that would effectively erase African American military contributions from the war's most visited battlefield for the next century. When the 50th anniversary commemoration was held in 1913, bringing thousands of aging veterans from both sides to Gettysburg, fewer than 10 black veterans were officially included, despite thousands having served in the war's later campaigns. One of those few, Lewis Miller of the 54th Massachusetts, told a reporter from the Pittsburgh Courier, "I have outlived most of the men who would have kept me away from here. I have outlived many who denied that we could fight or that we belonged in uniform. And I have lived long enough to return to this place and say to those who lie here, we finished what you started." As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, Gettysburg transformed from recent tragedy to sacred national shrine. This transformation process, The creation of what historians would later term collective memory became its own battlefield in the struggle for African American inclusion in the national narrative. The policies, monuments, and interpretive frameworks established during this period would shape how generations of Americans understood, or failed to understand, Black contributions to and stakes in the Civil War. By 1900, Gettysburg had become America's preeminent battlefield park, drawing tens of thousands of visitors annually. Yet its official interpretation, shaped largely by the War Department's commemoration policies and veteran organizations dominated by white Northerners and Southerners, presented a narrative of sectional reconciliation that minimized both slavery's centrality to the conflict and African Americans' roles in the war effort. "The Negro has vanished from the war at Gettysburg," wrote W.E.B. Du Bois after visiting the battlefield in 1910. "Walking these fields, one would never know that the battle was fought in a conflict that ultimately freed 4 million of my people, nor that hundreds of thousands of black men later wore the blue uniform. The reconciliation between white North and South seems to have been purchased with the silence of the black experience. This erasure was not accidental but systematic. When the United Confederate Veterans and the Grand Army of the Republic held joint Peace Jubilee ceremonies at Gettysburg in 1913, commemorating 50 years since the battle, the program carefully avoided mentions of slavery, emancipation, or black military service. African American veterans who applied to attend were largely rejected or shunted into segregated accommodations far from the main reunion grounds. Joseph Mack, who had served in the 41st U.S. Colored Infantry and traveled from North Carolina hoping to participate, recorded in his journal, turned away at the registration tent. The white clerk said no arrangements had been made for colored veterans. I reminded him I had fought for the same flag and drew the same pension as any other soldier. He replied, "This reunion is about healing the nation, not stirring up old troubles." Despite these official exclusions, African Americans continued creating their own commemorative practices at Gettysburg. The records of the Gettysburg National Military Park show that black churches and fraternal organizations regularly held Emancipation Day celebrations on the battlefield throughout the early 20th century, often gathering at the site of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address to read both the speech and the Emancipation Proclamation aloud. One of the most significant of these alternative commemorations occurred in August 1922, when the newly formed National Equal Rights League led a pilgrimage of over 300 African Americans to the battlefield. There, they laid wreaths at key landmarks and unveiled a temporary marker near the Soldiers' National Monument, dedicated to the colored troops who served after Gettysburg, making real the new birth of freedom proclaimed here. Park authorities removed the unauthorized marker within days, but the event received coverage in the black press nationwide. The Chicago Defender reported, "What happened at Gettysburg last week was nothing less than a reclaiming of ground stolen from us in the pages of history. If the government will not recognize our part in saving the Union, we will write our own monuments in our hearts and minds." The struggle for interpretive inclusion gained momentum during the New Deal era, when the National Park Service assumed control of Gettysburg National Military Park from the War Department in 1933. While still limited by prevailing racial attitudes, NPS historians began incorporating more nuanced perspectives on the war's causes and consequences into official battlefield interpretation. Dr. Carter G. Woodson, founder of the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, consulted with the Park Service in 1935, advocating for expanded interpretation that would connect Gettysburg to broader narratives of emancipation and civil rights. The battle must be understood not merely as a military event, Woodson argued in his report, but as a pivotal moment in the longer struggle for black freedom, a struggle that neither began nor ended with the Civil War. These efforts made incremental progress but faced consistent resistance. When the 75th anniversary reunion was held in 1938, the last major gathering of Civil War veterans at Gettysburg, only 16 African American veterans were officially invited to attend. Though now permitted on the reunion grounds, they were housed separately from white veterans and excluded from many ceremonial events. One of these veterans, Williams Henry Barnes of the 25th U.S. Colored Infantry, then 98 years old, made a powerful impression on journalists present. The Baltimore Afro-American quoted him addressing a small crowd that gathered around him near the Pennsylvania Memorial. "I came here not just for myself, but for all the colored boys who ain't here to see this day. The country wasn't ready to let us fight at Gettysburg, but after they saw all these white boys bleeding and dying here, they decided maybe our blood was red enough after all." By mid-century, as the modern civil rights movement gained momentum, Gettysburg became a site for drawing explicit connections between the unfinished work of the Civil War and contemporary struggles for racial justice. In 1963, exactly 100 years after the battle, Martin Luther King Jr. referenced Gettysburg in his "I Have a Dream" speech, implicitly linking Lincoln's new birth of freedom with the ongoing fight for full civil rights. That same year, civil rights organizations planned a major pilgrimage to Gettysburg for the centennial commemoration. Though overshadowed in national memory by the March on Washington later that summer, the Gettysburg gathering drew over 5,000 participants, mostly African Americans who processed from the town to Cemetery Ridge carrying signs that read, "From Gettysburg to Birmingham, and finish the fight." As a Baltimore Sun correspondent observed, "For these pilgrims, Gettysburg is not a completed chapter in American history, but an unfinished revolution. They walk these fields not in nostalgia, but in determination that the promises implied by Union victory might finally be fulfilled a century later." The Civil Rights era marked a turning point in how African American connections to Gettysburg would be remembered and interpreted. As American society slowly confronted its history of racial exclusion, the battlefield itself became ground zero for a new approach to Civil War memory, one that would finally acknowledge the centrality of slavery to the conflict and the contributions of Black Americans to both the war effort and its memorialization. The clearest manifestation of this shift came in 1973, when Gettysburg National Military Park hired its first African American interpretive ranger, James Paradis, a Vietnam veteran. With a degree in history from Howard University, Paradis developed specialized tours focused on the meaning of freedom at Gettysburg, connecting the battle to broader narratives of emancipation. Though initially considered peripheral to the park's interpretive mission, these tours grew increasingly popular, with visitors seeking a more comprehensive understanding of the battle's context and consequences. "What Ranger Paradis has shown us," wrote the Christian Science Monitor after covering one of his tours in 1975, "is that Gettysburg cannot be understood by tracking troop movements alone. The battle had meaning because of what was at stake, a proposition that all men are created equal, being tested in blood." This interpretive expansion coincided with growing academic interest in Black experiences at Gettysburg. In 1979, historian Harry Bradshaw Matthews published Forgotten Gettysburg African Americans Before, During, and After the Battle, the first comprehensive study of the subject. Drawing on pension records, church archives, and oral histories collected from descendants, Matthews documented over 200 African Americans who had lived in Adams County during the battle period, tracing their experiences and contributions. "What astonished me," Matthews told the New York Times upon the book's publication, "was not just that these stories had been overlooked, but that so much documentation existed once someone bothered to look for it. These weren't hidden histories so much as ignored ones." The groundwork laid by Matthews and others bloomed into more substantial commemorative efforts in the 1980s and 90s. In 1982, the Friends of the Gettysburg National Cemetery funded a new interpretive plaque connecting Lincoln's address to the later service of United States colored troops. The following year, the Abraham Bryan Farm, property owned by a free Black farmer that saw significant fighting during the battle's second day, was acquired by the National Park Service and incorporated into the battlefield's interpretive landscape by preserving Bryan's farm, explained Park Superintendent Jose Cisneros. "We help visitors understand that African Americans weren't abstract beneficiaries of Union victory, but real people with direct stakes in the battle's outcome. Bryan fled his home as Confederate forces approached, knowing capture might mean enslavement. His story is as much a part of Gettysburg as the charge of any regiment." Perhaps the most significant symbolic recognition came in 1998, when a new bronze sculpture titled from these honored dead was installed near the Park Visitor Center. Created by African-American sculptor Ed Hamilton, the piece depicts a United States colored troop soldier reading the Gettysburg Address, visually connecting the battle's aftermath to Black military service that it helped make possible. At the dedication ceremony, historian Alan Guelzo noted, "This monument recognizes something profound, that Gettysburg's significance extends beyond what happened here in those 3 days of July 1863. The battle opened gates through which African Americans would march in uniform, claiming through service the freedom and citizenship that had long been denied them." The 21st century has seen further expansion of African American interpretation. At Gettysburg, when a new museum and visitor center opened in 2008, its exhibits explicitly addressed slavery as the central cause of the Civil War and featured extensive coverage of Black experiences before, during, and after the battle. Archaeological excavations at the Bryan Farm and other sites have recovered artifacts connecting to Black life in Civil War-era Gettysburg, while expanded ranger programs regularly cover topics from Black civilian experiences during the Confederate invasion to the contributions of USCT veterans to post-war commemoration. Digital history initiatives have played crucial roles in this interpretive expansion. In 2017, the Gettysburg Foundation launched Black Experiences at Gettysburg, an online database documenting over 300 African Americans connected to the battle and its aftermath. The project includes interactive maps showing where Black residents lived before the battle, where many sought refuge during the Confederate occupation, and where they worked in recovery efforts afterward. "What digital tools allow us to do," explained project director Jill Ogline-Titus in an interview with NPR, "is demonstrate the ubiquity of Black experiences across the battlefield landscape. Visitors often express surprise that African Americans were there at Gettysburg. Our response is that they were everywhere, not in blue uniforms during the battle itself, but in every other aspect of this place and event." Contemporary commemorations have increasingly centered these Black experiences. During the battle's sesquicentennial in 2013, a major symposium titled Gettysburg: New Perspectives on African American Experiences featured leading scholars presenting research on topics ranging from Black civilian responses to the Confederate invasion to the role of Gettysburg in African American memory and literature. Perhaps most poignantly, descendants of Gettysburg's African American community have become active participants in battlefield interpretation and commemoration. Betty Dorsey Myers, great-granddaughter of Basil Biggs, the Black farmer who contracted to rebury Union dead, has worked with the park to document her family's connections to the battle's aftermath. In 2018, she helped dedicate a new wayside exhibit near the National Cemetery that details Biggs' crucial role in creating this hallowed ground. "My great-grandfather never received proper recognition in his lifetime," Myers told the Gettysburg Times at the dedication. But today, visitors from around the world will learn that Black hands helped create this sacred place. They'll understand that African Americans weren't passive recipients of freedom, but active agents in securing and memorializing it. As Gettysburg approaches its 160th anniversary, interpretation of African American experiences continues evolving. Recent scholarship has expanded beyond battlefield boundaries to explore how Black Americans nationwide viewed Gettysburg as a turning point in their own freedom struggles. From Frederick Douglass's contemporary reflections to civil rights activists' invocations of Lincoln's new birth of freedom, Gettysburg has functioned as a touchstone for generations of African Americans seeking to hold America accountable to its highest ideals. This reclamation of Gettysburg in Black memory represents the culmination of over a century and a half of persistence, from those first African Americans who aided the wounded and buried the dead, to modern historians and descendants insisting that their stories be told. Through their efforts, Gettysburg has been transformed from a site of historical erasure to a landscape where, at long last, Black experiences stand recognized as essential to understanding both the battle itself and the ongoing struggle to fulfill its promise. As historian David Blight observed at a recent symposium, the true legacy of Gettysburg for African Americans may be found not just in what happened here in 1863, but in their refusal, across generations, to allow their connections to this place to be forgotten. In reclaiming Gettysburg, they have helped America reclaim the moral center of its defining conflict.